Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of Floss Weekly. Yes, I'm back, and this week Aaron Newcomb joins me. We're going to talk about Pinax, a web framework that gives you building blocks for your websites. You're going to want to see this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Floss Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Floss Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Aaron Newcomb, episode 193 for November 30th, 2011, Pinax. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Ford, featuring available Sync with My Ford Touch. Sync with My Ford Touch gets you to your destination with integrated turn-by-turn directions and directional arrows displayed on screen. Check it out in the new 2012 Ford Focus and at Ford.com/technology. It's time for Floss Weekly, the show about free, libre, open-source software. I am your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, freshly back after my 2-week break. Of course, last week, as I mentioned in the show previous to that, I was having my 50th birthday, so I took the week off, and we had the All-British Invasion show, which was really great. It was a wonderful show. I listened to it a couple days ago. Had a great time with that. And, of course, those of you that are watching the video, you might see this is not just a bad shadow from bad lighting. I actually am starting to grow the beard. This is 8 days in. I'll talk more about that at the end of the show. But really, it's not about my beard, although I could just sit here and stroke it like a Unix gray beard sorts of wants to do, like pondering, but I won't do that. Instead, what I'll do is I'll bring on my co-host this week again, the wonderful Aaron Newcomb. Aaron, welcome back.
Hey, thanks. Good to be back again. It's been a while.
And you have the really big cameras and the cool microphone because you're in studio again.
That's right. It's nice to be here at the Brick House. At the Brick House, but yeah, there's a special treat coming up at the end of this show, so be sure you listen all the way out to the end because we have a special treat upcoming show. So we have a really great guest this week. We have James Tauber. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. Actually, that's not tough. That's not the hard part. The hard part is he's going to talk to us about Pinax. I've been pronouncing it every possible way in the last few weeks. We're going to have to ask him how this is actually pronounced. I think it's the most important question I've got for him. So the Pinax project is built. It's a web framework. So, you know, already we've had 72 of those on the show already. I think that we could call this the Web Framework Weekly Show. But no, so he's going to talk to us about how Pinax is different and what it does. It sits on top of Django. I know that part from reading some of the documentation. And it sort of provides frequently needed widgets that are on top of Django to do very common applications like login pages and things like that. At least that's what I could get from reading the documentation. So he's been around the project since the beginning. What's it say? Something like some number of years. Okay, that's great. And he's going to come and talk to us about Pinax in a moment. Since it's built on top of Django, you may want to pause this if you're listening to it in your podcaster there and go back and listen to episode 34 of Floss Weekly. We actually talked to the Django guy, Jacob Kaplan-Moss, or one of the guys with Django. And so if you want to catch up on what Django is before you listen to this show, that might actually be of some help. So I didn't do that, and so I've forgotten about what Django is as well. But anyway, so it's a web framework built for Perl. Built for Python, sorry. I slipped badly, don't I? I so want it to be a Perl framework, I know. Aaron, have you had any experience with Django or Pinax? I know Django. I know what it is. Like you say, you go down the list of web frameworks and you get to Python and there's Django. So, yeah, I know what Django is. Or I know a little bit about it. Never heard of Pinax or Pinax. I thought that's what you chop the wood with, but so I don't really know a whole lot about it. So it'll be really interesting to see, what that's all about. I mean, why not just use Django? I have no idea.
Yeah, great. Well, that's great. So it sounds like we've got a good opportunity for some really enlightening things coming up almost immediately. But first, I have a very important message to deliver to all of you. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Ford, featuring Sync with My Ford Touch. Sync is the in-car communications, entertainment, and connectivity system that's voice-activated to help you keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road. One of the great features of Sync is Sync Services. Sync Services gives you audible turn-by-turn directions to where you want to go and displays directional arrows on the screen, all without having to purchase an aftermarket or integrated navigation system. Sync Services also includes business search of over 40 million businesses, including telephone numbers, business information, and directions. A Send to Sync feature which enables you to use Google Maps or MapQuest from your home or office computer to plan a trip, save it online to your Sync Traffic Directions and Information Systems account, then use voice commands in your vehicle to get turn-by-turn directions. A free Sync Destinations app is available in the app stores, which gives you the mobile access to manage your Sync Traffic Directions and Information Systems account on the go, and the ability to pre-save destinations to your account, such as home or office. And plus, you can get traffic updates sent to your mobile phone via text message. It's all designed to keep your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road. Ford Sync with My Ford Touch is available in the 2012 Ford Focus. You can learn more about this and other technologies Ford is bringing to its vehicles at ford.com/technology. And now let's go ahead and bring on our guest. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And where are we speaking? No, that's backwards. I'm going to get that wrong every once in a while. Where are you speaking to us from?
I am just north of Boston, Massachusetts.
Oh, very good. But that's not a Boston accent, is it?
It's not by any means. Originally from Australia, but have been travelling back and forth the last 10 years or so. But now my home is here in the Boston area.
Very good, very good. Okay, enough on the Travelog channel here. Let's go ahead and talk about what we came to talk about, which is Pinax. Pinax. First off, how do you pronounce it? Because I've been doing a horrible job for the last 19 weeks. So,
Pinax is the pronunciation.
Pinax. See, I'm going to get this straight eventually. Okay, so I besides mispronouncing it horribly at the beginning of the show, I also did a horrible job of introducing it, I'm pretty sure. So why don't you go ahead and give us sort of the 30,000-foot view of what Pinax is about and what problem it solves?
Sure. So if you take a look at the sorts of things that you have to do to build websites, they typically fall into two categories. The stuff that's specific to your site and the stuff that really you'd find yourself doing again and again with almost every site that you build. Mm-hmm. Now, web frameworks take care of a lot of those pieces that you do again and again and again. They tend to deal with a lot of the what Leonard Lin from Upcoming refers to as below-the-line infrastructure, things like an object relational mapping to your database, templating languages, routing URL requests, and so on. But there's a whole other set of things that you do again and again and again when you're developing a website around things like account management, profile pages, comments, ratings, badges, friending people, inviting them to the site. And so what Pinax tries to do is provide a lot of that stuff for you so you can much more quickly get your website from idea to launch.
Okay, so is this similar, say, to something like having a collection of pre-installed WordPress plugins then? Much as I know about WordPress, I guess it's probably the end of it right there. But is it similar to that?
In some respects, although one of the differences between building something on WordPress and doing something with Pinax is that Pinax builds on top of the Django web framework. Mm-hmm. And rather than sort of taking a CMS or even blog-centric view of the world, which a lot of things like WordPress do, because Django is suitable for a very wide range of websites, including web applications that aren't necessarily as content-driven, Pinax is really focused on that broader range of components as well. So it's not just about adding a component to some content-driven site. If you're building a web application that has a lot of interactivity, then hopefully most of the pieces, the generic pieces that you need, Pinax can help with.
Now we had Jacob Kaplan-Moss on the show, but it was about 3 years ago, I think. So I remember very little about Django. Could you please refresh at least my memory and maybe your audience's memory about what Django does and how this sort of fits in on top of that?
Sure, absolutely. So Django is a popular web framework written in Python, I'm sorry to say, Randal, but it is written in Python. I mentioned before this whole idea of below-the-line infrastructure. What Django is essentially doing is it's still, the goal is to get you your site developed quicker, but what Django is taking care of is things like the object relational mapping to the database and marshalling and unmarshalling between the database and Python objects, providing forms, providing a templating language, providing routing of requests based on URL patterns. So a lot of the stuff that you need to do over and over again in sites, but it's very much infrastructural stuff that the user doesn't necessarily see. And so Pinax is not trying to do anything that Django already provides. In fact, it goes out of its way to try to be as Django compatible, and we're not trying to hide Django from people. We're trying to build on top of the knowledge that people already have of Django and do a lot more of the user-facing things that get done again and again in sites.
And what would be an example then of some of these things? I think you mentioned a couple of them a moment ago, but let's focus in on maybe one or two specific things. So what kind of a thing would Pinax give me that I wouldn't just get by just typing a lot of lines at Django?
Sure. So I'll use a concrete example. A few months ago, a friend and I developed a website called CodeNode, code spelled with a K. And the idea of the site is basically to collect code snippets in different languages, so you can compare how you would write something in Perl to how you would write the same bit of code in Python and so on, as well as take code in one language and show how it could be improved in that same language. But if you think of consider a site like that, the core of it is obviously to do with these snippets of code. But there's a lot of other stuff that we wanted to do on the site, starting with, we wanted to initially have the site in private beta. So there's the notion of waiting lists that people can sign up to, the ability to invite people from that waiting list to the site, the ability to vote on code snippets, to leave comments on code snippets. And those are the sorts of things that, even though on that particular site, CodeNode, it's being applied to these domain objects, things like invitations and following friends and commenting and rating are really generic components. And so Pinax provided those out of the box for us while we were developing that site. The other thing that Pinax does, which I haven't really mentioned yet, is that it provides both project scaffolding and sort of conventions around the way to lay out your project just to get things going faster, as well as some default templates, so that if you have an idea and you don't want to get caught up too early on with exactly the specifics of the sort of graphic design, we provide templates to enable quick prototyping as well. And jumping too far ahead, we recently switched to using Twitter's Bootstrap theme as the primary set of default templates that we provide. And if you're familiar with Twitter Bootstrap, one of the ways that when Twitter Bootstrap came out, in many ways it can be seen as the front end equivalent of what Pinax is trying to do for the back end.
Okay, so in terms of building websites, I know that there are a lot of common flow operations, like you said, like sending out invitations, managing ratings, and things like that. So what you've done in Pinax is essentially codify those and made those building blocks that sit on top of Django, which already provided some of the base layer materials.
Right. I mean, right from the start, Django had a very modular notion of doing these things, what Django refers to as apps. So Django from the outset made it fairly easy for people to provide third-party bundles that included templates and data models and view code and so on. But what we've essentially done is, and mostly extracted out of building sites rather than doing them in some abstract way, those common components, and making sure that they work well together as well. Because a lot of these pieces, it's one thing to build a component for waiting lists, or building a component for invitations, or building a component to help manage whether a site's in private beta or as open sign-up. But those three components really do need to know about each other because they interact in certain ways. And so that's another advantage of having this overarching umbrella of an ecosystem in Pinax, is that it enables us to make sure that the individual components, even though they are very loosely coupled, do know about each other and can play nicely.
So is the point of this to have different combinations of plugins and templates for different types of sites? Like you might have one for a CMS site, and then you might use another one for a content media site or something?
Exactly, and the analogy that I like to use there is, if you think of Lego, the way Lego works is they've got these very small components that all meet certain conventions in terms of the way they can be plugged together, but Lego sells them in kits that fall into certain themes. So you've got your space Lego that has some very generic pieces, has some pieces that are very specific to building spaceships, and similarly with castles and cities and all the other kind of stuff you can do with Lego. So similarly, we have these low-level components like rating and commenting and so on, but we can also put these together in predefined sets to get it easier to go with a particular kind of site. And probably the best example of that is something called Symposium, which is part of the Pinax project. It's for doing conference websites. So the last few years, we've built the conference website for both DjangoCon, the main US Django conference, and also US PyCon. And, if you think about what a conference needs to do, there's obviously very specific conference things around scheduling sessions and so on. But there's also a lot of these common pieces around things like people submitting talks and people reviewing them. And so what Symposium does is it takes these various pieces, some of them highly generic, some of them more oriented towards conferences, and provides them in a prepackaged way that can still be customized, but you've got a lot out of the box.
Right. I mean, it kind of reminds me, what you're saying kind of reminds me of back in the old days. I know I think you can actually still do it this way, but with Red Hat, when I was first running Red Hat, you would select, when you were installing, you'd say, oh, I want this to be, a web server, or I want this to be a desktop machine, and you would click that little checkbox, and then you could also like add in all the other stuff you wanted. And of course, behind the scenes, the package manager was actually making sure there wasn't any conflicts with all these things. But they had some predefined ones that you could pick, and it was actually kind of fun. I kind of miss it a little bit, but it sounds like it's a similar sort of thing, where you're actually saying, look, I want this to be this type of a website, this type of oriented website for whatever you're doing with it. But then I can also go back in and fine tune and add other plugins that I might need to do a specific task and fine tune it to get it just the way I want it.
Yep, exactly. The approach we're taking, though, the danger whenever you have that kind of, go through a checklist and almost configure what you want and then have it spit something out at the end, the danger that can often happen is you end up with something that's quite opaque, difficult to go in and change because you're not quite sure how it did things or the way that it did things. And we're very conscious of that very early on. And so the approach that we've taken, we're not quite there yet in terms of the sort of thing you were describing of having a package manager and so on that does a lot of the automated setup. We're building towards that, but the approach that we've taken is to as much as possible avoid magic, to make to just use standard Python packaging tools, things like pip and virtualenv, so that when the description of these what we call starter projects and their requirements and so on is not done through anything that's Pinax specific. It's just pip requirement files you install in virtualenv, and it still very much assumes that you are a web developer. Over time, the hope is that there'll be certain things that we're able to provide out of the box that can be configured purely via a web interface. But we wanted to get it right for the web developers first, because I think it's a much better approach to do that and then add some nice Chrome on top, if you like, rather than have this opaque magic going on under the covers that is very difficult to understand.
Is your goal then to become something like, and I know this might be going a little bit too far, but to become something like Squarespace, where you sign up, I mean, not you guys specifically, but to enable that type of functionality, to actually go that far to say, look, sign up for our site, drag the columns around where you want, add this functionality or that functionality, and you're done. Is that kind of where you're thinking this might lead to, or not quite?
I think so. I mean, we've talked about, and specifically Squarespace and that kind of thing a little while ago. We were talking about that, and I think eventually we'd like to get there, either within Pinax itself or yet another layer on top. One of the things that I think has been important for Pinax is that it is separate from Django, and having them be two separate projects helps avoid a lot of the problems of being monolithic. And similarly, if we were to really enable that kind of drag and drop web application building, I would rather that be a layer on top of Pinax rather than ingrained in Pinax itself, just because I think the moment that you make it monolithic, it makes it that much harder for people who want to do things slightly differently to go in and modify things.
Right. That makes sense. Now, since you brought it up, what's your relationship right now with the Django project? Do you work together, or do you throw things off to each other? Like, if you get something that maybe is a Django problem, do you kind of throw it over the fence? I mean, how's your working relationship with the Django team?
So most of the core contributors to Pinax are actually also core contributors to Django. So it's a very, very tight community in that regard. I think it's worked really well in as much as certainly we've been able to defer anything of a low-level technical nature to Django. But at the same time, we're able to experiment with a lot of things faster than Django's able to. We have a lot less of a installed base. It's a lot easier for us to... I used to make the joke that we're the sort of opinionated version of Django in that regard, but Django is pretty opinionated to start with, so Pinax is just sort of a more opinionated version. So that gave us an opportunity to try out a lot of technologies before it would have made sense for Django to. And some of the stuff that we've done has actually now been incorporated in Django itself. The whole way that that Django deals with static files was something that was initially... it was always built for Django, but it was largely developed as part of the Pinax project. But also, even sort of more general ecosystem things, the use of pip and virtual env, the use of Git and GitHub, those are the sorts of things that are now becoming increasingly prevalent in the broader Django community, but were largely trialed within Pinax first, and we were sort of at the bleeding edge of that.
That's really nice that you've had that kind of contribution back to the Django community then, although I now say it like it's separate, but it sounds like it's mostly overlapping. But how did this come about? What were you thinking when you said, I've got to do something on top of Django and I keep doing the same things, and maybe I should make a project out of it? What was that process, and where were you, and what were you solving?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, I often think of the rule of three, which was made popular by Martin Fowler. In the context that Martin Fowler talks about it in his refactoring book, he says that the second time you need to do something, you copy paste, but the third time you need to do something, you factor it out into a separate function. And it was essentially the same sort of thing for me building websites. I had various websites I was interested in building. I built what started off as a flashcard site called Quisition in 2006. In 2007, I built a little site to help people record their predictions of what would be revealed in the final Harry Potter book. And they seem like completely different sites, but what I found was that the sorts of things that I wanted to build for those two sites and other site ideas I had just kept coming up again and again. And I thought, well, if I take a step back and start to build those components, it started off not as a specific project. It started off more as a discussion within the Django community between myself and other people like James Bennett, who were thinking about how to make apps in Django more reusable, whether there were conventions that could be followed to make things play nicely together. Mm-hmm. One of the problems is that it's difficult to motivate people to build libraries or to build abstract implementations of things. There's a great quote from Anton de Saint-Exupéry, the author who wrote The Little Prince, and I can't remember the exact words, but the basic gist of it was that if you want to get people to build a boat, you don't hand them the wood and give them instructions. You instead teach them to yearn for the vast and endless seas. And similarly, the way to get people motivated to work on something like this is actually to build a website. So the group of people that I'd been talking to about these conventions for reusable apps in Django, we thought, well, let's actually try to build a website. That gives us a motivation for various components. And so we decided we'd build this. This was in early 2008. And at the time, it made a lot of sense to try our hand at building a social network. Mm-hmm. So we started building a social networking site with all of the things around microblogging and activity feeds and friending people and so on, and they became the initial components that came out of it. The downside of that approach was that a lot of people started to equate Pinax with social networks, and so you'll still find people say, well, Pinax isn't that just for social networks. I'm not interested in Pinax because I'm not building a social network. So it has advantages and disadvantages, going after a particular type of site first. But that's how it got started, and it's just grown from there.
I don't know if I read it from Martin Fowler, but that idea of 3 is actually pretty important. The way that I sort of came at it was that, you can build two different things that are similar, and you start to get a sense of maybe some of the pluggable parts of it. But until you build the third thing that's sort of off in a different direction, you don't see what knobs are correlated and what knobs have to be uncorrelated.
Exactly. You run the risk of premature generalization if you don't wait till the third instance. If we went and tried to build a component for comments or for rating or something like that based on one particular site that needed it, we'd run the risk of building it in a way that was very specific to that site. Once you have 2 or 3 sites, preferably 3 sites that need it, you've got a much better sense of, okay, these are the variations that you can have, these are the things that you need to make configurable.
Yeah, and especially until you've built the third site, you don't know, like these two values always got to be sort of moved together, or the whole thing sort of breaks apart. So you don't just want to make them 3 separate knobs. You want to make it one sort of gained knob that turns 2 things, and then the other knob over here to do the actual sort of third dimension on that. I've often taught, people have this tendency to really want to over abstract way too early and build these incredibly complicated systems, and so or they build systems that are so unpluggable that you're kind of stuck on the other direction. So I'm glad that you actually started this, and I also appreciate the fact that you started by building a real site. I'm looking at a similar thing about building a Perl 6 web framework to motivate Perl 6 better, and I said, wait a second, I can't just build a framework. I've got to actually go out and do something with it, make a site that's compelling that people want to play with. So
or make 3 sites.
It'll be hard enough getting people to make one, but yeah, no, totally, absolutely, I totally get that. Now, in doing this, how much of this do you end up then? How many of these structures and widgets, and I don't know what you'd call it in Pinax, are sort of canned with very few knobs, and how many of them have 27 knobs, but 26 of them have really great defaults?
Right. So. I think we've varied a lot with that and made a lot of mistakes in this, because the challenge comes when somebody, or if a particular website has a different requirement. To what extent do you try to enable that by adding a configuration setting to an existing app versus build an entirely different app? I think one of the mistakes that we made a couple of times in the last few years is to say, well, because this is broadly to do with groups, or it's broadly to do with points, let's just build a really generic group app. But because there are so many different ways that you could use it, we're going to need 10 different settings that you need to configure. So we're trying to move away from that now, and as sort of allow ourselves to have multiple apps that have a slightly different take on the same problem. One of the shifts that's happened in Pinax in the last year is moving away from us shipping all of the components as sort of one big batteries included bundle, and really thinking of Pinax more as an ecosystem where there are apps that are developed independently or with some small amount of collaboration with the core team, but that can easily be tried out. And if somebody has a better version of the ratings app, it's easy to substitute that in. If there are 2 takes on a rating app, then there's nothing wrong with necessarily with both of them being in the Pinax ecosystem. Because the last thing you want is, taken to the extreme, you can imagine a situation where you've actually only got one app and it's got 500 settings, and you turn them one particular way and you get a conference website, you turn them a different way and you get a flashcard site. We don't want to do that. And this comes back to the earlier point about us not wanting to be too magical and too opaque. You're still developing in Django when you're building a Pinax site. You're still writing Python code. So there's invariably things that you're going to have to do yourself, and it's just a case of having sensible defaults, but making it easy enough for when you do want to diverge slightly to just go in and make those changes.
I think that's really important because if I compare this a little bit with what has happened to some extent, and it's inevitable, I guess, but it happened to some extent with Drupal, for example. I had a Drupal 5 website with all these modules running that I really liked, and then those modules just became, they weren't maintained, they weren't used anymore. For whatever reason, they weren't able to be upgraded to the next version. And now I've got this old site that's very, very difficult to upgrade to the latest version of Drupal because those modules are all over the place. And so I think it also helps just being flexible enough to deal with things like that. I think is really, really important. So I'm glad you're approaching it from that angle.
Yeah, and it's not something that we necessarily got right from the start. It's something that we're learning in some respects in quite painful ways, but I think we're in pretty good shape now.
So you're sitting on top of the Django development community in that sense. And so you're providing sort of the next layer up. Are there parallel projects at this level that are out there? Are there formal projects that are organized the same way Pinax is done? Or are you just sort of like the leader in bundling up the next widget layer for the Django?
There are a number of projects that you could certainly characterize as sitting on top of Django. There's things like Satchmo for e-commerce, Django CMS, which is a CMS engine. One difference, though, is that they tend to be going after a very specific kind of site. And one of the challenges there is that it makes it difficult then if you're not building that kind of site, but you just want to use particular pieces that they provide. In some respects, I wish that those sorts of projects were built on top of Pinax, were these sort of starter projects that I mentioned before, the pre-bundled collections of apps, but otherwise followed more of the conventions that Pinax does, so that if you did want to combine e-commerce engine with your CMS, you're able to do that. If you want to add certain components to the conference website, for example, you would be able to. So there are things that definitely sit on top of Django, but nothing that's really trying to provide that broad platform on which almost any kind of site could be built.
Well, it sort of sounds then that if the Django community was smart, they would just simply say, whatever sort of abstractions the Pinax project has been able to bring to the table, we should just adopt that as Django's standard app library innovations and just merge you into the project. Is that something you would be objectionable to?
Well, I think the danger there is that it does become too monolithic. I think there's a lot of advantages in the fact that we're able to try out things and get them wrong without jeopardizing the entire Django community. The Django community is a lot larger. It would affect a lot more people if Django went down a particular path that turned out to be unfruitful. So I think it works better with the loose coupling that we have between Pinax and Django now, because I don't think that it would really gain much advantage to anyone having it be one monolithic project. I think the layering between the two is actually at a really good point for web developers. So I think it works well as two separate projects.
Cool.
Yeah, and on that note, it's probably better for the Django folks too. I mean, not to say that this isn't, the best project, the greatest project that will ever be, but I'm just saying, for them, there may be another Pinax at some point that that they want to work with as well. So, I mean, it works. I think it works out well for both sides of the fence, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, for me, I'm always interested in implementation. I mean, what do I need to do if I want to get this up and running? I mean, we talked a lot about Django, so I'm assuming that's a requirement, correct?
It is, but the way that we handle requirements, the stuff that we do everything with pip and virtualenv. So just say a little bit about those. Virtualenv is a Python tool for essentially isolating your environment from the perspective of Python, so that you're able to have particular Python libraries running for one particular website without worrying that some other website that you're developing on the same system needs different versions or incompatible versions. So virtualenv provides sort of an isolation. But then coupled with that is something called pip. Pip is a Python utility for installing Python packages built on top of distutils and other things in the Python community. Neither virtualenv nor pip are specific to Django. They're just general Python utilities. But what they enable you to do is say, okay, I want to create this isolated environment and I want to download and install into that environment these particular Python packages. So the core of Pinax and Django itself are just packages like that. So you can, once you have virtualenv set up, you can just basically pip install Pinax. And Pinax comes with a number of starter projects, but one of the things that we're really working on at the moment is expanding the number of starter projects we have. Each starter project comes with a requirements file that knows exactly what packages it needs to download, and that includes Django as well. So, if you're setting up one of our very basic starter projects is called the account project, and that really is a good starting point when all you know about your site is that it's going to have some sort of account management, user sign up, password resets, that kind of thing. So you take Pinax, you've got your account project, and you basically clone that and pip install the requirements, and that gives you Django. It gives you the various apps that are needed by that starter project.
So is this a script I'm running? I mean, is this to get it installed? Is this just a script that goes out? I guess once you have pipin installed, you run the script and then it works with pipin to go install the rest?
Yeah. Yes. Pip just takes a list of requirements and installs them into the environment, whether it's a real environment or a virtual environment. Pip just goes and installs those, and then those are available. Once you've pip installed Pinax, there's a command line that Pinax can use to clone starter projects. So you have your own version of the starter project, and then that starter project just has another requirements file that you type pip install, the name of the requirements file, and it will pull down the various packages that it needs.
Right. And then are there other requirements? Like I'm assuming this might get a little bit website specific, but things like PHP and those kinds of things, a database backend, is that required at all, or is that really all just dependent on the application you're running?
So if you're deploying, for example, to a stack that uses Postgres, or if you're developing locally with Postgres, then one of the requirements that you'll have in your requirements file is the backend for or the libraries for talking to Postgres, but they are just another library that you include in your requirements file. So there's nothing specific that you need to do in terms of running a different set of commands or anything like that. And again, this is nothing magical about Pinax or even Django. This is just something that's used broadly in Python.
Right. Now, what about configuration? How easy is this to configure? So I've run my script. Pip has gone. I keep saying Pippin now because Randal and I are having a Lord of the Rings discussion, not on the back chat. But to get this configured, is there a once I've run the script and pip goes out and does its thing, is there a website, like a /install type website you go to set up this? Because I'm assuming, like, especially if you have a database, you have to go in and say, okay, here's my, my username and my password to access the database and so forth.
Yep. So from this point, it's stock standard Django. So what that means is that you can immediately run the inbuilt web server that comes with Python, and bring up your website. But there's a single settings file that you can then go into to configure your database. That settings file is also where things like the particular apps that you've installed can be configured. So it's stock standard Django from that point. It just basically involves editing a settings file.
Okay, so that's pretty easy. So how long do you think, like if I wanted to start a blog, using one of the standard templates, front-end templates that you provide, how long do you think it would take, start to finish to get that set up and start working?
So with the probably need to step back and say a little bit about some of the differences in the last two versions of Pinax. But to answer your question first, in the next to most recent version of Pinax, it probably would have been 5 to 10 minutes work. We're in the process now with the latest version of doing a lot of cleanup and updating stuff and moving stuff over. And the starter project that you could use for a blog isn't quite ready yet. So it would take a little longer with the most recent version of Pinax, but certainly in previous versions and hopefully in the next couple of weeks, once we get caught up with that, it would be 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Well, we'll talk about that, what's coming up in just a minute. I want to ask you a couple more questions, though, in terms of the physical implementation of this. How well does this thing scale? Is it what's it suitable for? And maybe this is just, again, one of those questions that's dependent on what you're running on the website, as it normally is. But I mean, sure. In terms of what you're familiar with what people are doing with it, does it scale out to, very, very large sites, or is it restricted just to small and medium sites?
It certainly scales to very large sites, but there's a lot of stupid things you can do, obviously, to prevent that. So I mean, it really depends on exactly what you're doing with your data models and the kind of queries that you're going to want to be doing and so on. So Django itself does get used for some very large websites, but it also people can run into problems very early on, and it like a lot of these things, it really ends up being very little to do with Django or Pinax, and far more to do with how the data models were done, and whether there was sufficient denormalization given the kinds of queries that were being done, whether the templates have an opportunity to take advantage of caching and all that kind of stuff. So all of those things that you typically need to do to scale a website are all possible infrastructurally. Largely due to Django itself, rather than anything specific to Pinax. And then it's really up to the site developer to not screw things up. But certainly it's there's nothing stopping you from using Pinax to build very large sites.
Right, and I guess because this really is kind of an overlay to Django, it really does. I mean, really, there's not a whole lot, I'm assuming, that can get in the way, except for the code, something in the code or something in the implementation. So,
right.
Now, just as far as examples go, do you have any examples of sites that are using this, so that people watching and listening to this can go out and take a look if they want to see an example of a site running Pinax?
Sure. So to pick a few examples that vary wildly, just to sort of give a flavor of the variation, the PyCon website, the us.pycon.org conference website, is built with Pinax. I mentioned before the flashcard site that in some ways kicked it all off, Quisition.com. Type War is a typeface recognition game that was built on Pinax that has a different spin altogether. So they're a few examples. My company's own website, eldarian.com, is built on Pinax. The Pinax website itself is built on Pinax, and if you go there, you can actually get a list of various sites that the developers of which have told us that are built on Pinax, so you can get a good idea there of the kind of variation of what people are using it for.
Now, you've obviously done working with a bunch of other people then to develop Pinax, and I presume you're still the benevolent dictator and make the ultimate decisions, right?
Yeah, I think some people might think otherwise, but yeah, I mean, over the 3 years, there's probably been something on the order of 50 contributors at various times. There's sort of a smaller core team that's been active. People like Brian Rosner, right from the beginning, Janis Lytle, more recently Luke Hatcher and Patrick Altman. So there's a core of people that are using it on an almost daily basis, and then a larger group of around 50 people that over the years have contributed either patches or new apps or just ideas.
Is this being done in nights and weekends then, or are enough people doing this as maybe part of their day job and just support their websites that they can contribute serious time to it?
So it started off definitely as weekends and nights, but one of the motivations for doing this project was that I really wanted to do a startup around building websites quickly, both for clients and our own ideas. And so my own day job and pretty much involves working with Pinax every day. And my staff are all using Pinax, and a lot of the sites that we build for clients, the clients are very interested in Pinax and are quite willing to contribute it to it. So a lot of paid work that gets done for their sites actually, as long as it's generic and not something that's custom to the particular way they're doing things, actually ends up in Pinax as well. So there is a lot of Pinax work that ends up being sponsored, being paid for by people that are wanting sites built with it.
And how often do you find that you have a large people who use Pinax and develop their own sites and I don't know how to say this question, and don't really contribute back? Like all they're doing is just sucking down the stuff and making happy use of it.
I mean, it certainly doesn't bother me at all. I suspect it happens quite. I suspect it happens quite a lot. A lot of people will also, start with Pinax and then maybe, decide that it's provided enough of the scaffolding and they're not necessarily going to keep up with what's going on in Pinax. They'll just continue to build it on their own from that point. But there's certainly a lot of sites being built that we only sort of in passing find out about. And the core contributors are a fairly small group, but that doesn't particularly bother me if people are using it but not necessarily contributing back.
Now, other than the weekly company beer bash, then, do you have any sort of plans for a meetup of people that are heavily contributing to Pinax?
So the two main places that we do have an opportunity to meet up at are the two conferences that I've already mentioned, DjangoCon, the US, the primary Django conference, and PyCon, the primary Python conference. So both of those conferences feature a few days after the conference of sprinting. And so it's quite a culture in both conference communities to support open source projects, give people space and pizza and beer and stuff to stay a few days after the conference to code face to face. And Pinax has definitely benefited from that in both cases. In fact, in many ways, Pinax switched from being just me to being a group of people back at PyCon in 2008. So yeah, it's very much these conference-centered meetups that help to move things forward.
And what's on your future roadmap? Are you heading towards bigger and better things, I'm sure?
Yeah, so we just released yesterday. We call it an alpha, but it is actually used in production.
Aren't they all?
Well, it's kind of a weird thing how you decide what do alpha and beta even mean before 1.0. But anyway, we recently released 0.9 Alpha 2, which had quite dramatic differences from the first alpha. There was a huge gap between releases, and we changed a lot of things. But I think that sets us on the path now for a 1.0 release. I'm hoping that we'll do a 0.9 beta before the end of the year. and that the 0.9 final won't be far behind that. I think we've got a lot of the infrastructural stuff right now, certainly good enough for a 1.0. I don't know what it is about the Django community that they're so reluctant to go to 1.0. It took Django many years of sitting around the 0.9s, 0.95, 0.96 before they finally went 1.0. And we're sort of following the same path.
You could tell them that you're at 8 levels of 9s. It'd be great. Lots of excellence there. 8 9s.
And so, certainly 1.0 is the big one that we'll shoot for. A lot of the focus now, I mentioned before, this move towards being more of an ecosystem, and that has interesting implications for release management, because we're moving away from this sort of monolithic release where we have to pin everything with this ecosystem where a lot of the things are actually developed and released externally, generally by the same people, but they're still, for the most part, they're external repositories on GitHub, and they can be released independently. Mm-hmm. It raises the question of what does it even mean to declare a 1.0 of Pinax? In a lot of respects, it's similar to the sort of Linux distribution question of, obviously you've got the kernel number, revision number, but then you've also got, what version of the various components do you have? And that may mean that at some point we're able to switch Pinax to something like a timed release like Ubuntu does, where we basically say, okay, there's a particular date by which we take the stable versions of all of the components and say, okay, we're now going to test with these, and if they are past muster, then they're going to be included as part of the spring 2012 release of Pinax or something like that. But in terms of roadmap, most of the effort in the short term is going to be more starter projects, because there's a lot, in some respects, the individual apps that we've developed have jumped ahead of the starter projects that show how you combine them. So we need to do some catch up there with the starter projects. And the other thing that we really want to do is one of the concepts that came out very early on in the Pinax community was this idea of trying to build what I call contrafacts of well-known websites. Contrafact was a term from jazz music. What happened from a lot of the history of jazz, particularly in the bebop era, was that jazz musicians would create new songs based on the chord progressions of well-known songs of the day. Mm-hmm. The most famous of being something called Rhythm Changes, which came out of Gershwin's song "I Got Rhythm." So the idea in jazz music was, it's a well-known song, but you basically re-implement it yourself. Same chord progressions, different melody, so you neatly bypass copyright issues there, which was actually one of the motivations for them doing it. But the idea of contrafacts in Pinax is to say, well, what would it take to build, take some particular website? Maybe it's the Twit website, maybe it's something that's Geek List or Angel List or
Reddit.
Or Reddit, or some site like that, and say, okay, what's it going to take? Do we have the apps that we need to do it? If not, let's implement the apps. But then, in sort of a dash type, sprint type fashion, hackathon type fashion, try to build that site and open source that, use it as an example of how to build things in Pinax, and continue to build the Pinax ecosystem that way.
That's a really great idea, yeah.
And then, I mentioned earlier that the really longer term vision is probably around more of the providing stuff out of the box that can be configured without coding. But we want to get 1.0 right first. We want to get it to a point where developers really enjoy using it before we add any of the sugar on top to hide things from people that don't necessarily want to get involved with the code.
Sounds like a really grand plan. And before I let you go, because we're just about running out of time, but I didn't realize this, but until you sent in the show notes, we've met before. Can you describe the circumstances of how we've met?
So, in the late 90s and early noughties, I guess, I was heavily involved in the XML community, and I was invited to be one of the speakers on the XML Excursions Geek Cruise to the Caribbean in early 2001, and you were on that ship. And we actually worked together on the quiz night that was run one of the nights. You were the MC, I was the judge, and yeah.
That was a lot of fun, definitely, back in the day.
It was, yep.
Definitely. And, you know, I'm sorry, I had this haunting feeling that I knew your name from something, and I went, how do I know this name? I just know this name somehow. So I kept going, well, it's good to finally have you on the show so I could say that. Great. So like I said, we're just about running out of time, but is there anything we've left out of this conversation that you'd like to have our audience be sure to know about?
I think we've probably covered it all. As I mentioned, we did a big release yesterday that I definitely encourage people to try out. Even if you've tried out Pinax before, it would definitely be worth taking another look. And please just get involved, whether it's in writing apps for the ecosystem, trying to put together sites out of existing apps. If you've got a design bent, helping us with alternative themes. There's lots of different ways that people can contribute.
Very good, very good. Well, James, it's been a pleasure chatting with you again on this topic now. This topic didn't exist 10 years ago, so glad it's the first time we're talking about this topic, but glad to be chatting with you again, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. Very
good. That was James Tauber, who is the chief whipping guy for Pinax. Now that I know how to pronounce it, it's Pinax. Now I'll say it right forever from now on. Aaron, what'd you think?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You know, especially since I'm kind of going through this upgrade nightmare with my site on Drupal. You know, it's pretty interesting to see, to kind of compare and contrast that. I know they're a little bit different things here, but it's kind of interesting to compare and contrast what Pinax is doing and how they're approaching some of these problems that I've seen in the past from things like Drupal and WordPress, how they're approaching that. And I really appreciate the fact that they're kind of looking out for these little things, you know, making sure that things run well, making sure, I like this, the packaging idea of packaging all those things up together to run a certain way, and kind of making sure that things work out of the can, so to speak, before people just go throwing plugins willy-nilly at a problem and to try to see if it works. I mean, that can lead you down the road of really getting into some bad situations. So I kind of like the approach. So it might be something I check out for the future revisions of the source.
And one of the things I really like about this is that it's clear that the open source community sort of heals its own wounds, in the sense that, you know, it looked like the base layers for Django are great, and there are a lot of things that have been built on top of that, but a lot of non-reusable components. So when James and his crew said, let's build something that sort of builds these little modules out here to really make it a lot easier, I like that. Like they've had the stamina to pull that off and stay together and keep making more things off of it, and also his approach of taking an existing website and cannibalizing it and saying, well, what would it take to really redo this? Because if we give them enough tools to, you know, if we give them, if they can paint the Mona Lisa again, we're done. Yeah. You know, so, you know, I guess we're going to have black paint and brown paint and red paint and whatever like that to really look at it in terms of how do we duplicate this work of art already in using the new technology that we're trying to create. Is there enough tools and technologies in that? So it sounds really good.
Sounds just like Steve Jobs.
No, too soon, man, too soon.
Insensitive, sorry.
Yeah, I know. Speaking of too soon, we have some upcoming guests. That's this week's awkward transition. All right, for keeping track, I think that's 7 of something like that. We don't have many more people left on the list for this year. I am going to start my Q1 scheduling this weekend, so I have a feeling I'll be sending out about 35 pieces of email Saturday and Sunday. For those of you that have been emailing me wondering, well, when are you going to contact us about Q1? It's coming up soon. Truly, Terry Gillett, I'm speaking directly to you. I am going to email you. Hold on. Anyway, next week's the big week. Next week is the full Monty. I'm talking about nothing other than Monty Whitenius is coming on, talking to us about MariaDB and MySQL and all the history about all that, and maybe some thoughts about Sun's purchase of MySQL and maybe some Oracle's purchase of Sun. It should be sort of, that's why you're not on this show, Aaron. We don't want you on here having to talk about this stuff.
I know nothing.
you're off this one. You're safe. So instead, we have our Token X Sun employee, Simon Phipps, is going to be the co-host for that and give us his perspective now that he's safely many continents away from that. Kurt Von Fink's also going to join him for that. So we're going to get the perspective from both Monty and Kurt on that. Been working really hard to get that show to happen for almost like a year and a half, I think, at this point. But now they're coming in. David Mirza, Vega security tester, following us on that, sort of a penetration testing thing. And then we're going to have December 21st. I hope that's winter solstice. Is that exactly winter solstice? 21st, probably. We're going to have we just figured this out, the big Petaluma show. Yay. Aaron, you and I are going to both be, get this, in studio in Petaluma. Hooray. Because our guest wanted to come all the way from Europe to Petaluma, just straight to Petaluma and straight back. No, he's visiting some people in San Francisco. So he said, why don't I come up and do the show up there? So Peter Hinchins, the executive director of the guys that are producing Zero MQ, the great queuing system that's being used by a lot of applications, including Salt, the one we talked about a few weeks ago, is coming into the studio. So we're going to have the great Petaluma show. I'm actually sticking around Petaluma all day, so maybe I'll just keep dropping in on all the other shows that are happening. Maybe people just walk back behind the scenes on each one of the shows. You'll see me on every single show that's taped on Wednesday. Security Now and what else is on that schedule for Wednesday afternoon? Anyway, I'll be in all those shows. I guess. I don't
think we've ever had a show that's been
there's
not
never
without
been a FLOSS
Skype.
Weekly.
Yeah.
There's never been a FLOSS Weekly. It's all been no. I take that back. There has been one. And that's the day we interviewed Linus Torvalds. Because the two, me and the co-host, whose name I immediately forgot. Darn it, who was that? Anyway, and the guest. Oh, John O'Bacon.
John O'Bacon was here, yeah.
Yeah, back in the Bacon days. So, so this is going to be great. So we're actually doing a full, all in studio in the new, cool brick house. We're going to do the full Petaluma show coming on the 21st. On the 28th, I'll be back on Skype talking to Kleber Rosa about Autotest, which is a high-performance testing framework used by the Linux kernel, a bunch of other projects. Again, a lot of people on the shortlist, twit.tv/floss. We'll show you pretty much who we're probably going to have in Q1 up towards the front of that list there, but I won't bother with those until we're confirming those. To find out when I confirm those, you can follow us on Floss Weekly, the Identica and Twitter handle. Every time I post somebody new to the list, I also give you updates immediately. I also try to promote who's coming up this week on that Twitter handle as well. And I'll be in Portland this weekend. If you happen to be out that way, I'm going to be out singing karaoke. So had a great karaoke session a couple weeks ago. You can follow me on Merlin, MERLYN, on Twitter and Identica and a bunch of other places to figure out where I'm going to be if you want to hang out with me socially. I'm just all over the place. Like I was in San Jose yesterday. I mean, I tell you, I've had 8 plane flights between Portland trips on this one. So this is really strange. A couple weeks for me. And again, as I said, I'll be on Petaluma on December 21st. Also, as I told you before I left, I would start growing a beard. I know if you're watching the video, you can't see much here yet because I just apparently growing very slow. However, I am using the Everyday Phone app, which takes a picture of me every day at noon. Wherever it's pointed. No, I actually hold it up. Reminds me to take a picture of me every day at noon. And it automatically uploads to Facebook. So if you go to my Facebook page, or just search for Randal Schwartz there, probably the first or second one that you come up with will be me. One of my photo albums is, in fact, every day. And it will add a new picture of me growing out this fur every day. I'm committed to doing it for 28 days, and then it's probably all going to come back off. It is a little bit gray, which is about what I expect, but also a little bit of color, which I also wasn't expecting. So I'm not a Unix gray beard yet. That's, I think, all the plugging I want to do. Aaron, what's coming up for you?
Not a whole lot coming up. You can, except for that 21st show. I'm really excited to be in studio with everybody. But you can always follow me on. You can just go to aaron.newcomb.com if you want to see kind of a capsulation of everything I'm doing. I hang out mostly on Google+. So if you're on Google+, please add me to your circles. Put me in your circle. And I would appreciate that. And also, I believe we have a Floss Weekly Google+ page now, correct?
We do, but I'm doing absolutely nothing with it.
Same for the source. The source, my other video podcast, I've got a page there. I just grab the name, make sure it's there. I haven't started doing anything with it yet until there's more useful APIs. I
did the same thing. It's mostly because it isn't really, you can't really share it yet in the sense that you can't share it administration for it. It really is sort of, hung off of Randal Schwartz's account, and I don't really want to have it set up until you can post to it and I can post to it and Simon can post to it and stuff, so we keep up-to-date things on there. I don't want to have it be just me having to go there like some of the other places we have. So yeah, you can follow the FLOSS Weekly circle thing, but don't and I do
don't expect a lot yet.
Yeah, I do post a lot to Google Plus too. I'm actually kind of just I kind of blather all over the net. So just follow me in any one of the zillion places that I'm talking, mostly Twitter and Google Plus these days. So anyway, I think any other plugs, Aaron? I want to make sure.
Nah, that's good enough.
All right, good enough for the holidays. Yes, there we go. So I hear the little music coming up in the background. There must be the usual cue, and so you want to all follow us and come back again, because next week it's going to be the full Monty show. You're going to want to see that. So be back again next week on Floss Weekly.